They thought they were preparing for the invasion of the century. In Tokyo's dim war rooms, Japanese generals hunched over maps spread across long wooden tables. Lines, arrows, red circles marking American landing zones that existed only in their imagination. They believed they understood the mind of the American commander. They believed they could predict where the next blow would fall. They were wrong, terribly, disastrously wrong, because Japan fortified the wrong islands, poured soldiers into the wrong jungles, built bunkers where no enemy would ever come, and paid for that mistake with 40,000 dead men. Not in grand battles, not in heroic last stands, but in isolation, starvation, disease. Defending islands the Americans simply bypassed. This is not just a story of strategy. It is a story of human beings abandoned by their command, left to rot in places history forgot. It happened on a humid night on Bougainville. Japanese soldiers stood ready in their trenches, ammunition stacked, bayonets fixed. Officers whispering final instructions for an American assault they believed would come at dawn. They had been told, "America will attack here. This is the gateway to Australia. This island must be defended to the last man." But dawn came, and nothing happened. Not a shell, not a plane, not a landing craft. Days passed, weeks passed, still nothing. And then, one silent, horrifying realization spread through the Japanese ranks. The Americans were not coming. They had bypassed the island entirely. They simply sailed around it, left 40,000 men stranded in a jungle that would kill them long before the enemy ever did. Their officers had promised glorious battle, but what came instead was hunger, tropical disease, and the slow collapse of an army abandoned by its own empire. Before we go deeper into the tragedy Japan never prepared for, before we uncover how 40,000 soldiers vanished without firing a shot, make sure you like this video, subscribe for more untold history, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your support helps us bring forgotten stories back to life. Japan entered the Pacific War with absolute confidence. They saw themselves as masters of island warfare, experts in jungle defense, night attacks, and layered fortifications carved deep into rock. Their engineers built tunnels, pillboxes, artillery nests, fortresses designed to bleed invaders dry. But their confidence became their downfall. Because the Japanese High Command made a fatal assumption. They believed the Americans would fight island by island, slowly, predictably, painfully. And so Japan reinforced. Saipan, Tinian, Bougainville, New Britain, Biak, and dozens more. But America did not fight the war Japan expected. The U.S. adopted a new strategy, one so simple and so devastating that Japanese commanders refused to believe it, even as it destroyed them. Island hopping. The logic was brutal. If an island was not essential, if its airfields were useless, if it was too heavily defended, the U.S. would not attack it at all. They would skip it, cut off its supply lines, and leave thousands of soldiers to starve in the jungle. This strategy turned many Japanese strongholds into ghost islands, places where men waited for battles that would never come. They were told they were the shield of the empire. They were told American Marines were coming, so they dug trenches, laid camouflage, manned their rifles, and waited. But what was coming for them was not the U.S. Navy. It was malaria, dysentery, jungle fever, starvation, rotting wounds, isolation. Entire regiments began to shrink, not from American bullets, but from the merciless cruelty of tropical disease. One Japanese doctor wrote in his final diary entry, "We were not defeated by an enemy. We were defeated by the places our leaders sent us." The tragedy was no longer military. It was human. They were the strongest garrisons Japan ever built. Concrete bunkers poured by hand, artillery dug into cliffs, machine gun nests hidden inside coconut log pillboxes, miles of trenches twisting like veins through the jungle floor. These islands, Bougainville, Rabaul, New Britain, Kiska, were supposed to be the wall that stopped America. Tokyo believed these fortresses would trap U.S. Marines in endless meat-grinder battles. They believed each island would cost the Americans thousands of lives. They believed these defenses would make Washington hesitate, maybe even negotiate. Instead, they became mass graves, not because of American assaults, but because America never came. Imagine the feeling. You've been told you are the defender of an empire. You train for a glorious battle. You write farewell letters you expect to be found beside your body on the beach after the invasion. And then, nothing. Weeks pass, months pass, years pass. And you realize something your officers refuse to speak aloud. Japan has no plan to save you. Japan has no ships coming. Japan has no supplies left. Tokyo could not admit the truth. Even in their secret wartime diaries, Japanese generals described these garrisons as unable to retreat, unable to resupply, unable to be reinforced. In other words, sacrificed. Bougainville was the worst of all. 40,000 Japanese soldiers dug into an island the United States had no intention of capturing. The Americans only wanted one small piece of ground for an airfield. They took it, they built it, then they stopped. They didn't need to conquer the rest of the island. They just needed to wait. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of the slow death. Food ran out first: boiled leaves, raw taro roots, tree bark scraped and chewed until men bled from the mouth. Maggots picked from rotting meat. Then malaria swept through the regiments. Fevers so high soldiers tore their clothes off and crawled into rivers just to feel cold again. A Japanese medic on Bougainville wrote, "We lost 10 men in battle and 1,000 to the jungle." The jungle became both their enemy and their coffin. Rabaul was Japan's proudest stronghold, a fortress city carved into volcanic rock, a naval base so heavily defended the Japanese believed it would be the Gibraltar of the Pacific. 65,000 troops stood ready. America bypassed it completely. Not one major landing, not one ground assault, not one attempt to conquer it. Instead, U.S. bombers trapped the entire garrison behind a curtain of fire and steel, destroying supply convoys, sinking transport ships, blocking escape routes. The soldiers on Rabaul dug deeper into their tunnels as the supplies vanished. Rice ration, 2 bowls a day. 1 bowl a day, half a bowl. A handful, nothing. Eyewitness accounts describe Japanese soldiers so starved they could barely lift rifles. Yet they saluted their officers every morning, even as their bodies trembled from hunger. One survivor wrote, "We became ghosts long before the war ended." 1943, 1944, 1945. 3 years in which thousands of men died without hearing a single American voice. Some fell sick and were buried in shallow jungle graves that washed away in the rain. Some walked into the forest and never returned. Some sat beneath palm trees and closed their eyes, too weak to stand again. Many left notes in their diaries like this one. "We have not seen the enemy, but the enemy has defeated us." The Japanese high command knew these garrisons were doomed. They knew supplies would never reach them. They knew disease and hunger would wipe out entire divisions. And still, they ordered the men to stay, to fight if attacked, to die if necessary, to hold useless ground that meant nothing. It was not strategy, it was stubbornness, pride, denial. And 40,000 men with families, wives, children, paid the price buried in jungles where no battle ever came. They thought they were fighting Americans, but the men abandoned on Bougainville, Rabaul, and the forgotten islands of the Pacific soon realized they were fighting something far older, far hungrier, and far more merciless: the islands themselves. No explosions, no gunfire, no thunder of artillery. Just heat, rain, disease, rot, silence. Nature became the new enemy. And unlike humans, nature does not negotiate, retreat, or surrender. On Bougainville, the jungle swallowed men whole. The undergrowth grew so thick that soldiers had to crawl on their bellies. The humidity was so brutal that boots rotted into black mush within weeks. Mosquitoes arrived in clouds so dense they looked like drifting smoke. Japanese soldiers began scratching until their skin tore open. Wounds became infected. Fever set in. Delirium followed. One Japanese lieutenant described malaria on Bougainville like this: "The jungle itself entered our blood." But the jungle didn't just attack the body. It attacked the mind. Men heard voices in the night. They saw shadows moving in the trees. They believed the spirits of the island were coming for them. And slowly, the line between hallucination and reality dissolved. By 1944, starvation became the command no one could disobey. Rations disappeared. Supply lines were destroyed. The Japanese Navy had been crippled. No cargo ships remained. No aircraft could break through Allied control. So the soldiers turned to whatever the jungle offered. Snails, worms, tree bark, roots, rats, leaves boiled into bitter tea that barely stopped the hunger. More than one unit resorted to eating leather belts and satchels soaked in water, trying to soften them enough to chew. In some regiments, officers tore out pages of their manuals and ate the paper. One diary entry said, "We now eat knowledge to stay alive." By early 1945, entire battalions were reduced to skeletons wrapped in uniforms. Men could not stand. Men could not speak. Men could not even salute. They simply lay in the mud and waited. On several islands, surviving Japanese troops fled to the mountains, believing they could escape disease by climbing higher. They were wrong. The mountains held their own cruelty. Freezing rain, thin, cold air, slippery cliffs, caves filled with bats, endless fog. No food at all. One survivor wrote, "We escaped the jungle only to be killed by the sky." Men slipped off ridges in the night, falling hundreds of meters. Others froze to death while huddled next to campfires that would not stay lit. When the Americans eventually reached these high ridges, they did not find soldiers. They found bones scattered along the trails. Rabaul's garrison, once one of Japan's proudest armies, died in silence. No gunfire marked their end. No battles, no heroic last stands. Just a slow, steady fading. As if the island were draining the life from them one breath at a time. American pilots flying overhead described Rabaul as a ghost city. Roads empty, gun positions abandoned, entire regiments missing. When Australia's 5th Division finally landed near Rabaul in 1945, they expected fierce resistance. Instead, they saw Japanese soldiers emerge from tunnels with hands trembling, cheeks sunken, bodies shaking violently. Not from fear, but from months of starvation. Some survivors could not walk. Some could not talk. Some could not even lift their hands to surrender. One Australian officer wrote, "These men weren't defeated. They were consumed." Japanese military culture worshipped the idea of loyalty. Fight to the end. Die for the emperor. Never surrender. But on these forgotten islands, the idea of honor shattered. What is honor when your stomach has been empty for 12 days? What is glory when your skin is covered in sores from insect bites? What is loyalty when your officers are too weak to stand, too sick to command? What is courage when you haven't seen an enemy soldier for months? One diary entry, found next to the remains of a Japanese sergeant, summed up the truth. "Our commanders say we are heroes, but heroes do not starve. On islands, Japan fortified with pride, expectations, and propaganda." An entire generation of soldiers discovered a brutal reality. They were not warriors. They were sacrifices. By mid-1945, Allied forces expected the last phase of the Pacific War to be brutal. But nothing prepared them for what they found on the islands Japan fortified so proudly. the islands that were supposed to stop the American advance, the islands where Tokyo promised its men, "You will never be abandoned." But the truth was the opposite. Japan fortified the wrong islands, and the men stationed there paid with their bodies and their lives. When U.S. Marines pushed deeper into Bougainville's interior and Australian patrols advanced on New Britain, they did not find entrenched armies ready to fight. They found shadows wearing uniforms, shadows carrying rifles that could no longer be fired, shadows whose boots had rotted away until only bloody cloth remained. Some soldiers emerged from the jungle holding white rags, hands shaking, skin hanging from bone. A U.S. Marine sergeant later said, "These weren't our enemies anymore. They were men asking to stop dying." Many Japanese soldiers collapsed during surrender, their bodies too weak to stand after months of starvation and sickness. Some were carried on makeshift stretchers, others crawled on all fours. Some whispered apologies for not being able to walk. The war had not defeated them. The islands had. The tragedy did not end with surrender. The Americans offered food, rice, crackers, canned meat. But so many Japanese soldiers were so severely starved that even a handful of food was fatal. Their internal organs had shut down. Their bodies could not process nourishment. They died minutes after eating. Australian medics wrote in their reports, "We saved some from hunger, only for hunger to kill them. Others were too weak to drink water. Some could no longer swallow. Some were in such advanced stages of dehydration that their throats had collapsed inward." These were not soldiers defeated in battle. They were victims of abandonment. In Tokyo, the High Command already knew. They received every report, every request for supplies, every desperate message. "We are starving. We cannot fight. We need evacuation." And every time, Tokyo gave the same answer: silence. Why? Because admitting Bougainville, New Britain, and the other islands were lost would mean admitting the Pacific strategy had collapsed. Japan would rather sacrifice 40,000 men than admit it had fortified the wrong places. One Japanese colonel later said during interrogation, "The islands were already tombs. You just didn't tell the men we buried there." General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, held out until his body gave up. He continued issuing orders even when he could no longer walk. He whispered messages even when his voice had disappeared. He wrote reports even when his hands trembled uncontrollably. But not a single one of those reports ever reached a ship. Japan had already abandoned him. By the time Australian forces found him, he was so malnourished that he couldn't lift his head. His last recorded words were, "Japan will never surrender." But the truth is brutal. Japan had surrendered him long before those words left his lips. He died not from battle wounds, but from starvation. The same silent executioner that claimed most of his army. When the war finally ended, teams searching the jungles of Bougainville, New Britain, the Solomons, and the Marianas found something heartbreaking. Skeletons everywhere. Some still sitting against tree trunks, some lying face first in the mud, some curled into fetal positions under roots and vines. Some grouped together under makeshift shelters, men who died side by side, refusing to leave one another. In many places, the jungle had grown over them. Vines twisting through rib cages, leaves sprouting through skulls. As if the islands themselves were claiming ownership. A U.S. Navy chaplain wrote in his diary, "The jungle took its dead back into the earth." Of the 40,000-plus Japanese soldiers who died on these misguided island fortresses, 87% never fired a bullet. They didn't die in glorious charges. They didn't die defending the emperor's last line. They didn't die meeting the enemy face to face. They died quietly, slowly, forgotten. When Japan fortified these islands, Saipan, Tinian, Bougainville, New Britain, they believed they were building a shield. But they were building graves. They placed their faith in maps, lines, and pride, not in strategy, not in logistics, not in the lives of their soldiers. And decades later, historians agree. The islands Japan chose to fortify became the places where their soldiers were sacrificed. This is not just military history. This is a human tragedy. A tragedy written not in gunfire, but in silence. A tragedy where the jungle, the mountains, the hunger, and the disease became the true victors. A tragedy where brave men died not because they failed, but because their leaders did.